So with 10th edition 40k expected fairly soon, and a lot of complaints about rules bloat in the game, is this one way that Games Workshop could take an easy win to make 40k a bit more streamlined? Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today I wanted to revisit a potential design choice from 40k's past and talk about whether or not universal special rules might be a potential choice to make 40k a little bit more streamlined and playable and collect a whole bunch of similar rules under some simple umbrellas. Universal special rules are a concept from Warhammer 40k's past. They were really quite a big thing in the 7th edition Warhammer 40k rulebook and previous editions before that, and they remain a big thing in Warhammer the Horus Heresy. Quite a chunky section of the book is detailing a whole bunch of special rules that certain units and weapons might get. The way that these things worked in previous editions were that you get a big table of the rules in the core rulebook, things that were shared in common by a fair bunch of different factions in the game. Then in the codexes, it could perhaps be a way to make certain units function a bit differently, by say declaring that this unit gets fearless or this one gets rending on its attacks, and various other variations like that. For the most part, Games Workshop did just decide to axe the entire section going into 8th edition, and I think a lot of people could see why at that point. We'll talk about some of their negatives in a second. A lot of universal special rules became just special rules within a codex for things like, say, Deep Strike, or they were just put out in full on each unit's datasheet, so you'd always have all of the special rules for one unit written out in front of you. Every so often, though, whenever people talk about rules bloat in Warhammer 40k, the idea that they might be able to come back in some form has been floated, and it does look like there could be some pretty easy scope for at least a few of them to come back in 10th edition Warhammer 40k if Games Workshop wanted them to. A whole bunch of rules that are just very similar throughout multiple different codexes, so why not just make them universal and a bit more all-encompassing? Just out of the current Horus Heresy rulebook, here's a few examples of universal special rules. You can get weapon-specific rules such as Haywire, where you can auto-wound against vehicles, do glancing hits in Heresy, or on 6s auto-penetrate them. Pinning rules for things like sniper rifles or some barrage weapons. If you suffer unsaved wounds, then you take a pinning test, and if you fail that morale check, then the unit can't do things next turn. There's some that affect combat, such as Hatred, where you get to re-roll hits in the first round of combat against one hated foe, or Hit and Run, where you get to strike at the enemy, and then after the fight phase you get to move 2d6 inches away, potentially falling back to strike somewhere else than you. There's a whole load of different ones that maybe don't fit into obvious categories though, things like the Swarm rule, where blasts and templates cause double wounds against small diminutive foes, and Stubborn, where units get to ignore negative morale tests and pinning tests. A lot of these rules operate in one way or another throughout the Warhammer 40k codexes, and potentially drawing some like rules together under these sort of titles might not be the worst thing if you wanted to create a bit more simplicity. I'd say perhaps the biggest advantages of getting universal special rules is maybe a bit of a shift in mental load. Having more rules be universal perhaps allows you to understand what an enemy's codex is going to do a bit better. With a whole load of rules that have different names and slightly different effects, it's perhaps not going to be as easy to get a grip on what your opponents might be able to do in game, whereas if they could just say that their attacks have the rending special rule and are pinning, for example, then that might be a bit easier to understand, as in general the majority of players would gradually get to know the common universal special rules within a game, and what they're likely to do on the tabletop. Would be a bit of a learning curve for things that don't come up all that often, but still maybe a bit easier than just having individual rules per codex. I'd say another way that it could also help out would be to cut down on certain minor variations between rules. I certainly remember throughout 8th edition there were multiple different variations of rules that allowed units to protect characters. Some intercepted hits, some intercepted wounds after failed saves, and some just prevented them being shot altogether, and they were all a little bit confusing in their minor variations and how they worked on a mechanical level. I feel like they tried to keep things a little bit more unified throughout 9th edition, but I feel like it might just be a bit easier if all these units with minor variations on their rules were all unified under one banner, as opposed to being potentially printed slightly differently in each and every codex. I feel like there is some incentive there, at least for really obvious ones, though I would say that there's plenty of disadvantages to them as well. With the current system, you could certainly tailor the individual rules to really try and reflect what you're trying to achieve out of each individual codex. Say, for example, for a -1 damage special rule, that might be good just to have outright on certain units, but it looks like, say, for Orcs with their Ramshackle special rule, it only applies to weapons that are strength 7 or less. And if you did just stick to them all being universal, then you might create some problems for yourself, where a rule's potentially just hard to apply to units in the codex and have the effect that you want to achieve. You can potentially fix that on certain datasheets, say this faction gets the feel no pain type save, but only against these attacks, but then that kind of goes against the whole point of keeping them sort of universal in the first place, if you are going to have different variations that people still need to remember. Throughout 7th edition and Horus Heresy as well, I certainly feel like the section has got the potential to get very, very bloated, lots of redundant or little used rules. I'd argue that perhaps the Horus Heresy Age of Darkness rulebook does kind of show this a bit. There's a whole bunch of really dense pages on all the special rules for the units in the game, and I feel like maybe being built off 7th edition, there's still so many rules in the game to the extent where it's perhaps a bit of an unhelpful level, and still takes a lot of page flipping and referencing for ones that come up a little bit more rarely. I remember in the 7th edition 40k rulebook, there were some universal special rules that just seemed kind of pointless to include in the first place. I remember one called Soul Blaze that just had the chance to do a very minor bit of damage in later turns. It was kind of forgettable and felt like rules bloat for bloat's sake, and then it got a little bit too stacked on top of each other when you had certain rules that were just combinations of other universal special rules, which kind of seemed pointless. On top of that, I feel like these tables maybe don't hold up amazingly well to edition changes. If you got a new edition of Warhammer 40k and they decide to rewrite half the special rules on the table, it could drastically change how a whole bunch of armies work. Some codexes have been massive beneficiaries of the rewritten rules, whereas some might have their units really ruined by having their underlying special rules changed, and it's all a bit arbitrary with some winners, some losers. It definitely doesn't tend to make things more balanced in any way. I guess as well there is the potential for a little bit more page flipping as well. If you don't have the rules printed on the actual datasheet in the codex, you might well need 2 books out rather than 1, which could be a bit more of a headache in game, up to the point where you've memorised them by heart. I think some combination of the above were probably why they decided to remove them when they went into 8th edition. The section in 40k had got rather bloated. You could try and reform it a bit, as what they did with Horus Heresy The Age of Darkness, but they decided to go for a very different strategy and farm out all the special rules onto datasheets instead. It does have its advantages, but maybe a few things might have just gone a little bit too far. Just for a few examples of some rules that might make sense to be universal special rules in 10th edition, here's a short list, and I'm sure we could add plenty more if you wanted to. I'd personally argue though it probably makes sense to keep the list of universal special rules kind of small and things that are very easily generalized between different factions, things that are already on lots of datasheets and could just use a bit of a tidy up and something made a bit more universal and all-encompassing. Perhaps one of the most obvious are the Feel No Pain type saves, Feel No Pain being the old rule for the universal special rule, but now all these saves are called something slightly different, but whatever you call them, they're basically the ability to ignore a suffered wound on the dice roll of X+, so say a 6+ for a Space Marine Apothecary's healing aura. This one's really common throughout the game, on plenty of medics across the galaxy. Some units just have it innately, things like Death Company or Death Guard Poxwalkers for example, or you can get it from certain things like psychic spells or warlord traits. Essentially this is a universal special rule, and there are things that say that you can't stack them or anything like that. It just doesn't really make too much sense to me to have a million different versions of this. It could be quite easily unified, and any questions related to the rule addressed in the core rulebook at that point. Setup rules like Deep Strike and Infiltrate type things will be good. Most codexes tend to have Deep Strike type rules as written as the unit arrives from reserve outside of 9 inches of enemy forces. Things like teleporting Terminators, Tau battlesuits coming down from Manta Strike, or even things that teleport you around the board, like say the Umbralific Crystal of the Thousand Suns. Some armies do things a little bit differently, like Demons or Genestealer Cult, and I guess they could still have their own special rules for them, but I feel like the vast majority of the armies literally have the same rule here, and it might not be the worst idea to have it unified. Bodyguard type rules, as mentioned, would be quite a useful one to have universal. Games Workshop even made changes to all the bodyguard rules in the game on the balanced data slate, and that meant that they had to specifically call out a whole ton of different units for how they worked, whereas they could have just made the alteration to one rule in an errata or something if they'd wanted to update that otherwise. Forward deployment type units seem to be a reasonable one as well. Usually that's set up in the midfield greater than 9 inches from enemy units or their own deployment zone, and also potentially the cluster of rules that relates to aircraft as well. Things like -1 to be hit, can't charge or be charged normally, you get to pivot when you're turning, and you could even have some universal special rules for the hover type mode, which is common to a whole load of aircraft, like say Storm Talons or Valkyrie gunships. I'm not really sure whether you'd need to expand a universal special rule type list to be quite as big as the Horus Heresy one. I feel like at that point it's getting kind of clunky, but just for the sake of taking a few easy wins, it might be sensible to have a small one. and just unify a few of the things that they're reprinting time and time again in the different codexes, sometimes with minor annoying variations, sometimes basically the same rule over again. Could be potentially an interesting thing that they could do with universal stratagems a bit more as well. We had some recent rules rumours for 10th edition that said they might expand some lists, like having a universal fights in death rule for characters, or perhaps a universal type intercept or subet scan type stratagem. Those rumours are definitely completely unsubstantiated at the moment, but again, that does seem like it could be an easy way to have a bit of a win rules-wise, and try and take a few of the more common gotcha type stratagems as a more general one, so your opponent is generally going to know that they're coming because everyone can use them. Let me know your thoughts though. Would you be in favour of a bit of a slimline version of Universal Special Rules for 10th edition if they came out with one? Or do you feel that that's a bit of a step back from where Warhammer 40k has come thus far? Let me know your thoughts down in the comments below, and feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics if you'd like to see more videos like this. I do tend to post new Warhammer videos just about every day. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that links down in the video description. The channel's Patreon page is what allows me to keep on making videos like this quite so regularly, so if you are enjoying a lot, any support is enormously appreciated. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is in the video description below. In any case, an enormous thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.